The December wind cut through the Texas plains like a blade drawn from winter's sheath, carrying with it the scent of sage and something darker, something that spoke of secrets buried deep in the unforgiving earth. On this bitter morning in 1860, Captain James Mitchell of the Texas Rangers pulled his coat tighter as he surveyed the Comanche camp spread before them like scattered bones across the frozen landscape. Steam rose from his horse's nostrils as the animal shifted restlessly beneath him, sensing what the men could not yet comprehend, that they were about to uncover a mystery that would haunt the frontier for generations to come. "There," whispered Sergeant Tom Bradley, pointing toward a solitary figure hunched over a cook fire near the edge of the camp. White woman, blue eyes. Mitchell raised his field glasses, the metal cold against his weathered face. Through the wavering heat of the fire, he saw her, a woman of perhaps 30 years, her blonde hair braided in the Comanche fashion, her skin bronzed by decades under the Texas sun. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who belonged to this world, stirring something in a pot with the practiced ease of a lifetime. Yet those eyes, when she glanced up at the approaching riders, held the unmistakable blue of European ancestry. The wind howled across the plains, bending the winter grass into silver waves, as if the very earth were trying to whisper warnings about the woman they had come to claim. 24 years earlier, May 19th, the morning had begun like any other at Fort Parker, with Sarah Catherine Mills helping her mother, Rebecca, tend to the vegetable garden behind their modest cabin. At 8 years old, Sarah possessed the kind of bright curiosity that drove her to wander beyond the safety of the fort's walls, collecting wildflowers and chasing butterflies through the tall grass. Her father, Benjamin Mills, had built their home on the outer edge of the settlement, believing that the recent peace treaties with the local tribes made such positioning safe. He could not have been more wrong. The attack came without warning, like thunder erupting from a clear sky. War cries split the morning air as dozens of Comanche and Kiowa warriors poured over the hills surrounding the fort. The sound of hoofbeats drummed against the earth like an approaching storm, while the settlers scrambled for weapons that seemed suddenly inadequate against the tide of painted faces and gleaming steel. Sarah had been playing near the creek when the screaming started. She turned toward the fort to see smoke rising from several buildings, black against the pristine blue sky. Her small legs carried her as fast as they could toward home, but the chaos had already begun to consume everything she had ever known. Rebecca Mills died trying to protect her youngest daughter, falling beneath a Comanche lance just yards from their cabin door. Benjamin met his end, attempting to reload his musket, his hands shaking with desperate fury as warriors closed in around him. In the space of minutes, Sarah's entire world dissolved into blood and fire and the terrible silence that follows violence. When the dust settled and the war party prepared to depart, they found the girl hiding beneath an overturned wagon, her blue eyes wide with terror, but alive with something the warriors recognized: the fierce will to survive that marked those destined to endure. War Chief Iron Wolf studied the trembling child for a long moment before making a decision that would alter the course of many lives. Instead of killing her, he lifted Sarah onto his horse and carried her away from the smoldering ruins of Fort Parker, away from everything she had ever known, and into a life that would transform her from Sarah Catherine Mills into someone entirely different. The child who disappeared that day would emerge 24 years later as Naduah, wife of War Chief Peter Nokona, mother of 2 children, and a woman who had forgotten the taste of her mother's cornbread, but could track a deer for miles across the hard, scrabbled terrain of the Lino Estacado. Present day, December 5th. Captain Mitchell lowered his field glasses and felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders like snow. He had been searching for white captives for the better part of 2 decades, following leads that usually ended in graves or empty prairie. But this woman, there was something about her that made his pulse quicken with recognition, though he could not place why. "Orders, Captain?" Bradley asked, his breath forming crystals in the frigid air. Mitchell studied the Comanche camp below. Roughly 40 warriors, twice as many women and children, and perhaps 100 horses scattered across the winter grass. It was a substantial band, but not insurmountable for his company of 30 rangers. What concerned him more was the woman herself, the way she moved, the way the Comanche children gathered around her with obvious affection, the way the warriors seemed to defer to her presence. This was no trembling captive awaiting rescue. This was a woman who had found her place in the world, and they were about to tear her from it. "We go in peaceful," Mitchell decided, though his hand never strayed far from his Colt. "If she's been with them this long, charging in with guns blazing won't help anyone." The descent toward the camp felt like riding into a dream. The wind carried the sound of drums and distant singing, while smoke from cook fires created a hazy atmosphere that seemed to blur the line between reality and imagination. As they drew closer, Mitchell could see the woman more clearly. She wore traditional Comanche dress, decorated with intricate beadwork, and her movements possessed the unconscious confidence of someone who had spent decades adapting to this harsh landscape. When the rangers reached the edge of the camp, War Chief Naduah emerged from the largest tipi, his face a mask of controlled tension. He was a man in his prime, perhaps 35, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Behind him, the woman they had come to find stepped into view, and Mitchell felt his breath catch in his throat. Her blue eyes surveyed the rangers with a mixture of weariness and something else, a kind of resigned recognition that suggested she had always known this moment would come. When she spoke, it was in fluent Comanche, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned her place through years of proving herself worthy. "Why have you come to our winter camp?" she asked, though her gaze remained fixed on Mitchell as if she already knew the answer. Naduah's response was swift and protective, his hand moving instinctively toward the war axe at his belt. The woman, Naduah, he called her, placed a restraining hand on his arm while continuing to study the rangers with those impossibly blue eyes. Mitchell dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Ma'am," he said, removing his hat despite the cold, "I'm Captain James Mitchell, Texas Rangers. We've come because there are people back east who've been searching for you for a very long time." The woman's expression did not change, but something flickered in her eyes, a shadow of memory perhaps, or recognition of a language she had not heard spoken with kindness in more than 2 decades. "I am Naduah," she replied in accented English, her voice carefully modulated. "I do not know of whom you speak." But Mitchell could see the truth in the way her hands trembled slightly as she spoke, in the way she unconsciously touched the beaded necklace at her throat, a gesture that seemed more like a prayer than a nervous habit. "Your name," he said gently, "was Sarah Catherine Mills. You were taken from Fort Parker in 1836. Your uncle, Isaac Parker, has been searching for you ever since." The words hit her like physical blows. Naduah took a step backward, her hand reaching for Naduah's support as memories long buried began clawing their way to the surface. Images flashed through her mind. A woman's voice singing lullabies, the smell of fresh bread, the sound of her father's laughter echoing across a vegetable garden that no longer existed. "Sarah is dead," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "She died with her family at the fort." Mitchell watched the internal struggle play out across her features, the war between 2 worlds, 2 identities, 2 completely different versions of the same woman. Around them, the Comanche camp had grown silent, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing something momentous. "Your family," Mitchell continued, his voice gentle but insistent, "had a peculiar scar on your left shoulder. A burn from when you reached too close to a cook fire as a baby." Naduah's hand moved involuntarily to her shoulder, her fingers tracing the mark beneath her buckskin dress. The gesture confirmed what Mitchell had suspected. This was indeed Sarah Catherine Mills, the lost daughter of Fort Parker, transformed by time and trauma into someone entirely different. But as he watched her face, Mitchell began to understand that the real mystery was not where she had been for 24 years. The real mystery was what they were about to do to her, by bringing her back. 3 hours later, Naduah sat in Captain Mitchell's field tent, wrapped in a wool blanket that felt foreign against skin accustomed to buffalo hide and buckskin. The rangers had allowed her to bring her infant daughter, Prairie Flower, but her son Quanah had been left with Peta Nocona, a separation that tore at her heart like a physical wound. Sergeant Bradley attempted to question her in English, but her responses came haltingly, mixed with Comanche phrases that seemed to carry more truth than any translation could convey. Her story, as it emerged through careful questioning, painted a picture that challenged everything the Rangers thought they knew about captivity and survival. "I was given to the family of War Chief Iron Wolf," she explained, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "His wife, who had lost her own daughter to the white man's diseases, claimed me as her own. I was taught to work hides, to gather roots and berries, to follow the buffalo herds. I learned that survival depends not on who you were born to be, but on who you choose to become." Mitchell studied her face as she spoke, noting the way her features softened when she mentioned Iron Wolf's wife, the pride that crept into her voice when she described learning traditional skills. This was not the broken woman they had expected to find. This was someone who had not merely survived her captivity, she had thrived within it. "When did you marry Peta Nocona?" he asked. A shadow crossed her features. "I was 16 winters. Iron Wolf arranged the marriage to secure alliance between our band and Peta Nocona's people. But it became more than politics. He has been a good husband, a good father to our children." The pain in her voice was unmistakable. She was speaking of him in past tense, as if their separation had already become final. "Mrs. Sarah," Mitchell corrected himself, struggling with what to call her. "Your Uncle Isaac has spent 24 years searching for you. He's convinced the Texas legislature to offer rewards for information about white captives. He's never given up hope." Naduah, for she could not yet think of herself as Sarah, stared at the tent wall, as if seeing through it to a past she had thought buried forever. "Uncle Isaac," she repeated slowly, and for the first time since they had found her, tears gathered in her blue eyes. "He used to carve wooden horses for me. Said I would have a real one someday." The memory seemed to unlock something inside her, and suddenly the carefully constructed walls between her two identities began to crumble. She remembered the smell of her mother's kitchen, the sound of church bells on Sunday morning, the feeling of sleeping in a real bed with clean sheets. But she also remembered the loneliness of being the only white face in a world that had initially viewed her with suspicion, the gradual acceptance that came through years of proving herself worthy, the deep love she had developed for people who had become her true family. "What will happen to my children?" she asked, the question that had been haunting her since the Rangers arrived. Mitchell exchanged glances with Bradley. They had protocols for returning white captives, but those protocols assumed the captives wanted to be returned. They certainly didn't account for children born of unions between captives and their captors. "Your daughter can come with you," Mitchell said carefully. "As for your son, he stays with his father," Naduah finished, her voice hollow with loss. "Because he looks too much like his Comanche blood." The truth of it hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Quanah, her beloved son, bore the features of his father's people too strongly to ever be accepted in white society. He would remain with the Comanche, growing up to become, though none of them could know it then, one of the most formidable war chiefs in tribal history. As evening approached and the wind outside the tent grew more bitter, Mitchell began to understand that they had uncovered far more than a missing person case. They had stumbled into a living embodiment of the frontier's deepest conflicts, the collision between two ways of life, two definitions of family, two completely different understandings of what it meant to belong somewhere. Naduah's story, as it emerged through hours of careful questioning, revealed details that would change how people thought about captivity forever. She described a complex society with its own codes of honor, its own justice, its own sophisticated understanding of survival. She spoke of seasonal migrations that followed natural rhythms, older than any white settlement, of ceremonies that connected people to the land in ways that transcended ownership, of children raised by entire communities rather than isolated families. But she also spoke of violence, raids and counter-raids that had claimed lives on both sides, a cycle of revenge that stretched back generations and showed no signs of ending. Her own captivity had been part of that cycle, just as her recovery would undoubtedly trigger new violence in return. The newspapers will want to interview you, Mitchell warned her as darkness fell outside the tent. Your story, it's going to be big news. The whole country has been following cases like yours. Naduah looked down at her sleeping daughter, Prairie Flower's tiny face, peaceful in the lamplight. What will they want me to say? The truth, I suppose, about what happened to you, about how you survived. She was quiet for a long moment, and when she looked up, Mitchell saw something in her expression that made him deeply uncomfortable. A kind of resigned acceptance that suggested she already understood how her story would be received, how it would be twisted to serve purposes she never intended. The truth, she said slowly, is that Sarah Catherine Mills died at Fort Parker 24 years ago. What you have found is someone else entirely, someone who learned to love people you will call savages, someone who found family among those you call enemies, someone who discovered that survival sometimes means becoming something your original self could never have imagined. Her words carried the weight of prophecy, and Mitchell felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December wind. He was beginning to realize that bringing Naduah back to white society might not be the rescue mission he had imagined. It might instead be a form of cruelty disguised as mercy. Late that night, alone in his tent while Naduah slept under guard in the adjacent shelter, Mitchell began documenting the case that would soon consume newspaper headlines across the nation. He had been tasked with finding white captives and returning them to civilization, but the woman they had discovered challenged every assumption underlying that mission. The physical evidence was irrefutable: the scar on her shoulder, the bone structure of her face, the blue eyes that marked her European ancestry. But the psychological evidence told a more complex story. This was not a woman desperate for rescue. This was someone being torn from a life she had chosen to embrace. His field notes, written by lamplight as the wind howled outside, captured details that would haunt him for years to come. Subject responds to Comanche name Naduah more readily than birth name Sarah. Demonstrates complete fluency in Comanche language and customs. Shows signs of genuine grief at separation from husband and son. Questions whether this constitutes rescue or abduction remain unresolved. Mitchell paused in his writing, staring at the last sentence he had written. In all his years as a ranger, he had never questioned whether bringing someone home was the right thing to do. But watching Naduah's face as they rode away from the camp, seeing the way she looked back at her husband and son until they disappeared behind the rolling hills, had planted seeds of doubt that were growing into something larger. The case files scattered across his field desk told similar stories. White captives recovered after years or decades with various tribes, most of whom struggled to readjust to the society of their birth. Many died within months of their return, unable to adapt to a way of life they had forgotten. Others spent their remaining years in a kind of cultural limbo, belonging fully to neither world. As midnight approached, Mitchell made a decision that would complicate the case considerably. He began a second set of notes, this one documenting not just the facts of Naduah's recovery, but the broader questions her case raised about the nature of identity, family, and belonging on the American frontier. These notes would eventually find their way to journalists and scholars, who would use them to craft narratives that served their own purposes. But on that cold December night, Mitchell was simply trying to understand how a simple rescue mission had become something far more complex and morally ambiguous. Dawn broke gray and bitter over the Texas plains as the Rangers prepared to begin the journey back to civilization. Naduah emerged from her tent, clutching Prairie Flower, her face composed but her eyes red from a sleepless night. She had spent the dark hours listening to the wind and remembering everything she was leaving behind. The sound of Peta Nokona's breathing beside her, the way Quano's small hand felt in hers, the particular silence that came just before dawn in a Comanche camp. The goodbye had been brutal in its brevity. Pitanokona had held her for a long moment, speaking in Comanche words that carried the weight of a lifetime's love compressed into a few desperate sentences. Quana, only 6 years old, had clung to her legs until his father gently pulled him away, explaining in terms a child could understand that his mother had to return to her first people, just as the buffalo return to their ancient grazing grounds when the seasons change. Now, as she mounted the horse Mitchell had provided, Naduah felt the full weight of the choice that had been made for her. Behind them, the Comanche camp was already breaking apart, families packing their belongings onto travois and preparing to move deeper into the wilderness where the rangers could not follow. Her husband and son would soon be nothing more than figures disappearing into the vastness of the Lino Estacado. "It's about a week's ride to Austin," Mitchell told her as they set out across the winter landscape. "We'll stop in smaller towns along the way. Word of your recovery has already spread. There may be crowds." Naduah said nothing, but Mitchell noticed how she unconsciously pulled Prairie Flower closer to her chest, as if protecting the child from something that had not yet revealed itself. As they rode, the landscape began to change. The wild, open prairie gave way to more settled areas, farms carved out of former hunting grounds, roads that imposed geometric patterns on land that had once flowed in natural curves, fences that divided the earth into pieces that could be owned and sold. Each mile took them further from the world where Naduah belonged, and closer to one where she would always be an outsider looking in. By midday, they encountered their first evidence of how her story was being received in the outside world. A rider approached from the direction of Austin, carrying newspapers and mail for the Ranger Company. The headline of the Austin Statesman made Mitchell's stomach tighten with apprehension. "Captive white woman recovered from savage tribe. Former Fort Parker victim found after 24 years in heathen captivity." Mitchell kept the newspaper away from Naduah, but he could tell from her expression that she understood the general nature of what was written there. Her face had taken on the careful blankness that he recognized from his dealings with Native Americans, the mask worn by people who had learned that showing emotion only provided weapons for their enemies. As they made camp that evening beside a creek that ran cold and clear through a grove of bare cottonwoods, Mitchell found himself studying the woman who had become the center of a story much larger than either of them had anticipated. She sat apart from the rangers, nursing Prairie Flower while humming a Comanche lullaby that seemed to carry all the loneliness of the plains. The wind picked up after sunset, bending the skeletal branches of the cottonwoods and creating a sound like whispered conversations in a language no white man could understand. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called to its pack, the sound wild and mournful and infinitely distant. Mitchell made his final notes for the day by firelight, documenting the beginning of what he increasingly understood would be a journey toward tragedy rather than triumph. Tomorrow they would reach the first town large enough to have a telegraph office, and the story of Naduah's recovery would begin spreading across the nation like wildfire. But as he watched her silhouette against the dying flames, holding her daughter close while staring out into the darkness toward the life she had left behind, Mitchell began to suspect that the real mystery was not where Sarah Catherine Mills had been for 24 years. The real mystery was what would happen to Naduah now that they had found her. The wind carried the scent of change across the Texas plains, and somewhere in the distance the sound of approaching hoofbeats suggested that their small party was about to become the center of attention they had never wanted. Mitchell's hand moved instinctively to his weapon as shapes emerged from the darkness. But whether these newcomers brought salvation or something far more dangerous remained to be seen. The woman caught between two worlds clutched her daughter closer, her blue eyes reflecting the firelight as she prepared to face whatever came next. Behind them lay everything she had ever loved. Ahead waited a civilization that would claim her as their own, while never truly accepting who she had become. And in the shadows beyond the firelight, forces were already gathering that would transform her personal tragedy into something far larger and more complex than a simple story of rescue and return. The riders that emerged from the darkness were not the threat Captain Mitchell had feared, but something potentially more dangerous: journalists. 3 men on horseback approached the ranger camp with the confident swagger of those who believed themselves entitled to any story worth telling. Their leader, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and eyes that missed nothing, dismounted with theatrical flourish. "Captain Mitchell," the man called out, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Theodore Hartwell, Austin's statesman. We've ridden hard to catch up with your party. Our readers are quite eager to hear about the miraculous recovery of the Parker captive." Mitchell felt Naduah stiffen beside the fire, her arms tightening protectively around Prairie Flower. The way Hartwell said "Parker captive" made her sound like a trophy rather than a human being, and Mitchell could see the calculation in the journalist's eyes as he studied her by firelight. "This is not the time or place for interviews, Mr. Hartwell," Mitchell replied, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "The lady has been through considerable trauma." Hartwell's smile never wavered, but his eyes sharpened. "Of course, Captain, we understand the delicate nature of the situation, but surely the public has a right to hear about this remarkable rescue. 24 years of savage captivity. The nation is fascinated by her story." The words hit Naduah like physical blows. Savage captivity, the casual dismissal of everything she had learned to love, everything that had shaped her into who she had become. She looked up at the journalist with those startling blue eyes, and when she spoke, her voice carried decades of hard-won dignity. "I am not remarkable," she said in careful English, each word weighted with meaning. "I am simply a woman who learned to survive." Hartwell's eyes lit up with predatory interest. This was exactly the kind of quote that would sell newspapers across the country. He pulled out a small notebook, already scribbling, but Mitchell's hand closed over his wrist with surprising gentleness. "I said not now, Mr. Hartwell. The lady needs rest." But the damage had been done. Even as the journalists reluctantly withdrew to make their own camp downriver, Mitchell could see that something fundamental had shifted. Naduah was no longer just a person being returned to her family. She had become a story, a symbol, a commodity to be consumed by a public hungry for tales of frontier drama. The town of Cedar Creek, December 8. 3 days later they reached Cedar Creek, a settlement that had grown up around a trading post and now boasted nearly 200 residents, a general store, and most importantly for their purposes, a telegraph office. Mitchell had hoped to pass through quietly, but word of their approach had spread faster than wildfire. By the time they rode down the main street, nearly the entire population had gathered to catch a glimpse of the famous captive. The crowd that lined the muddy thoroughfare was a study in contradictions. Some faces showed genuine sympathy and curiosity, but others displayed the kind of morbid fascination usually reserved for public execution. Children pointed and whispered, while their mothers pulled them closer, as if Naduah might somehow contaminate them with her wildness. "Look at her," Mitchell heard one woman whisper to her companion. "Gone native, she has. Probably doesn't even remember how to use proper utensils. I heard she has savage children," another voice added. "Born in sin, if you ask me." Naduah rode through the gauntlet of stares and whispers with her face composed, but Mitchell could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hand unconsciously moved to shield Prairie Flower from the crowd's scrutiny. This was worse than any battle he had ever fought. This slow assassination of dignity disguised as curiosity. Dr. Jonathan Whitmore, the town's physician and most educated resident, approached their party with the bearing of a man accustomed to handling delicate situations. He was perhaps 50 years old, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and the sort of gentle authority that came from years of treating both bullet wounds and broken hearts. "Captain Mitchell," Dr. Whitmore said, removing his hat. "I'm Jonathan Whitmore. I've prepared quarters for your party at my home, away from the crowd. The lady and her child will need medical examination before continuing to Austin." Mitchell felt a surge of gratitude for the doctor's tact. Here, finally, was someone who seemed to understand that Naduah was a person rather than a spectacle. Dr. Whitmore's house stood at the edge of town, a two-story frame structure surrounded by bare oak trees and a white picket fence that seemed to represent everything. Naduah had left behind 24 years ago. As they approached, she stared at the building with an expression Mitchell couldn't quite read, part recognition, part terror, as if she was seeing her own grave. Dr. Whitmore's examination room was a study in civilized order. Glass cabinets filled with instruments, medical texts arranged in neat rows, the sharp smell of carbolic acid that spoke of modern scientific methods. Naduah sat on the examination table holding prairie flower, her eyes taking in details that must have seemed alien after decades of living in tipis and traveling with the seasons. "I need to document your physical condition," Dr. Whitmore explained gently, his voice carrying none of the sensationalism that had marked the journalist's questions. "For medical purposes, and also because there will likely be legal proceedings regarding your recovery." Legal proceedings. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Mitchell, standing guard at the door, felt his stomach tighten with understanding. Naduah's return was going to complicate far more than just her personal life. The examination revealed what Mitchell had already suspected. This was a woman who had adapted completely to her environment. Her hands bore the calluses of someone who had worked buffalo hides and gathered food from the land. Her body showed the marks of childbirth and hard living, but also a fundamental healthiness that spoke of a life lived in harmony with natural rhythms. "Remarkable," Dr. Whitmore murmured as he completed his notes. 24 years of captivity, yet you show none of the physical deterioration we typically see in rescued captives. May I ask, were you well treated by your captors?" The question revealed how little the outside world understood about her experience. Naduah looked at the doctor with something approaching pity. "They were not my captors," she said quietly. "They were my family." Dr. Whitmore paused in his note-taking, his pen hovering over the paper as he processed the implications of her words. Like Mitchell, he was beginning to understand that this case challenged every assumption about captivity and rescue. "Your daughter," he said, examining Prairie Flower with professional care. "She appears healthy, beautiful child. But I'm afraid—" "I know," Naduah interrupted. "You are afraid of what she represents. A bridge between two worlds that your people prefer to keep separate." The brutal honesty of her assessment left Dr. Whitmore speechless. In his clinical notes, later reviewed by territorial authorities, he would write, "Patient demonstrates complete psychological adaptation to Comanche lifestyle. Questions arise regarding whether forced reintegration serves patients' best interests." But that night, as Naduah sat by the window in the guest room Dr. Whitmore had provided, staring out at a landscape that looked tamed and diminished compared to the vast plains she had left behind, she began to understand the true nature of the trap that was closing around her. In the telegraph office, messages flew back and forth across the growing nation like electronic wildfire. Mitchell's official report to Ranger headquarters was terse and professional, but it sparked a flurry of communications that revealed how many people had vested interests in Naduah's story. To Texas Ranger headquarters, Austin from Captain J. Mitchell, Cedar Creek subject, recovery of Sarah Catherine Mills, captive confirmed alive, proceeding to Austin for debriefing, complications expected. The response came within hours. To Captain J. Mitchell, Cedar Creek from Kel Ford, Ranger headquarters governor. Houston demands full investigation. Military implications significant. Handle with utmost care. But it was the message that arrived 2 hours later that made Mitchell's blood run cold. To Captain J. Mitchell, Cedar Creek, from I. Parker, Palestine, Texas. My dear niece found at last. Bringing family to Austin. Newspaper. Men offering substantial sums for exclusive interviews. God's will be done. Isaac Parker. The uncle who had spent 24 years searching for his brother's daughter, the man whose relentless pressure had kept the Rangers looking for white captives long after most cases went cold, Mitchell had expected gratitude, perhaps tears of joy, but the mention of newspaper money and the ominous phrase "God's will be done" suggested something far more complex was at work. Dr. Whitmore found Mitchell in the telegraph office that evening, both men drawn by the same growing sense of unease about what they had set in motion. "I've been thinking about our patient," Dr. Whitmore said without preamble. "About what we're really doing to her." Mitchell looked up from the stack of messages he had been reviewing. "Meaning, we're treating this as a rescue, but from her perspective, we've kidnapped her. Torn her away from her husband, her son, everything she's built her adult life around. For what? To satisfy the emotional needs of an uncle she barely remembers." The doctor's words gave voice to doubts that had been growing in Mitchell's mind since the moment they found Naduah. But they also raised questions that went far beyond personal tragedy. "There's something else," Mitchell said, handing Dr. Whitmore one of the telegrams. "Military intelligence wants to debrief her. Apparently, her husband Peta Nokona is considered one of the most dangerous war chiefs on the frontier. They think she might have information about Comanche military capabilities." Dr. Whitmore read the message with growing alarm. "They want to use her as a spy against her own family." "Not exactly, but they want to know everything she knows about Comanche movements, winter camps, alliance structures. Information that could help the army track down and defeat the people she considers her real family." The two men sat in silence as the implications sank in. Naduah's recovery was not just a personal story. It was becoming a matter of military intelligence, territorial politics, and cultural warfare. She was caught in the middle of forces much larger than herself, and every choice she made from now on would be seen through the lens of competing loyalties. That night, as Cedar Creek settled into the kind of frontier silence broken only by distant coyotes and the creak of settling timber, Naduah received an unexpected visitor. She was sitting by her window, braiding Prairie Flower's hair in the Comanche fashion, while humming the lullabies that connected her daughter to the world they had left behind. When a soft knock came at her door, Dr. Whitmore entered with the careful movements of someone who understood he was intruding on private grief. He carried a tray of tea and simple food, but his real purpose became clear when he closed the door behind him and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. What would you prefer I call you?" "Naduah," she replied without hesitation. "Sarah Catherine Mills was a child who died long ago." "Naduah, then. I've been a frontier doctor for 15 years. I've seen what happens to people caught between worlds, and I'm concerned about what awaits you in Austin." She turned from the window to study his face in the lamplight. "You believe I should run?" It wasn't a question, and Dr. Whitmore realized that this woman possessed the kind of intelligence that cut through pretense to reach truth, with uncomfortable directness. "I believe," he said carefully, "that you should understand what you're walking into. Your uncle Isaac Parker has become something of a celebrity in his own right. He's given lectures about the frontier, written articles about the necessity of rescuing white captives. Your recovery validates 24 years of his life. And if I do not wish to be validated?" Dr. Whitmore set down the tea tray and pulled a chair close to hers. "Then you'll discover that sometimes being rescued is another form of captivity." He pulled out a newspaper clipping he had been carrying in his vest pocket, one of many that had arrived on the afternoon stage. The headline read, "Savage Bride Returns to Civilization." "They're already writing your story," he continued. "Books, newspapers, serials, lecture tours. You've become a symbol of something larger than yourself. The question is whether you want to control that symbol or let others use it for their own purposes." Naduah read the article with growing horror. The writer had taken the few facts available and constructed a narrative of constant degradation and suffering, painting her Comanche family as brutal captors and her survival as a testament to the superiority of white civilization. Nothing in the article bore any resemblance to her actual experience. "They have made me into a lie," she said finally. "Yes. The question is what you're going to do about it." She was quiet for a long moment, staring down at Prairie Flower's sleeping face. When she looked up, Her blue eyes held a determination that reminded Dr. Whitmore why she had survived 24 years on the frontier. "What would you do, Dr. Whitmore, if someone stole your life and sold it as entertainment?" "I suppose," he said slowly, "I would try to tell the truth, even if no one wanted to hear it." The next morning brought new complications in the form of Lieutenant Colonel William Sherman, arriving from Austin with a small detachment of cavalry and a mandate from the territorial government to conduct a full investigation into Naduah's captivity. Sherman was a career military man with the bearing of someone who had seen combat on multiple frontiers, but his interest in Naduah was purely strategic. "Mrs. Mills," he said, having decided to use her birth name regardless of her preferences, "I'm Colonel Sherman, United States Army. I need to ask you some questions about your time with the Comanche." Mitchell watched the interrogation from across Dr. Whitmore's parlor, noting how Sherman's questions were designed to extract military intelligence rather than understand human experience. Where were the winter camps located? How many warriors did Peternocona command? What did she know about planned raids against white settlements? Naduah answered some questions and deflected others with the skill of someone who had learned to navigate between competing loyalty. But Mitchell could see the toll it was taking. The way her shoulders tensed when Sherman pressed for details about her husband's military activities. The protective way she held Prairie Flower when he asked about Comanche child-rearing practices. "You understand," Sherman said at one point, his voice carrying subtle threat, "that you have a duty to your birth people. Information you provide could save white lives." "And cost Comanche lives," Naduah replied evenly. "Do you believe one kind of life is worth more than another, Colonel?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Sherman's face flushed with anger at having his assumptions challenged so directly. But before he could respond, Dr. Whitmore intervened. "Colonel, I believe that's enough for today. My patient needs rest." But Sherman was not finished. He pulled Mitchell aside as they prepared to continue toward Austin, his voice low and urgent. "Captain, I need you to understand something. Peternocona is responsible for raids that have killed dozens of settlers. If his wife has information that could help us track him down, we need it. This is bigger than one woman's personal feelings." Mitchell found himself in the impossible position of understanding both perspectives. As a ranger, he had seen the aftermath of Comanche raids, burned homesteads, scalped families, children carried off into captivity, but he had also seen Naduah's face when they forced her to leave her own children behind. "What if she refuses to cooperate?" he asked. Sherman's smile was cold as winter wind. "Then we'll have to question whether she's truly been rescued, or whether she remains loyal to her captors. Treason is a serious charge, Captain. Even for women." The threat was clear: cooperate or face prosecution as a traitor. Mitchell began to understand that Naduah's return to civilization might be more dangerous than her captivity had ever been. That evening, as they made camp one day's ride from Austin, Naduah finally told Mitchell the whole truth about what had happened at Fort Parker and what she had discovered about her family's death in the years since. "I was not the only survivor," she said, staring into the fire as if seeing the past in its flames. "My cousin John Parker was also taken. He was ransomed back 3 years later, but by then he was broken. He died within months of his return." Mitchell listened with growing unease as she continued. "There were others too. Rachel Plummer, my aunt, Elizabeth Kellogg. Both recovered after shorter captivities. Both struggled to readjust. Rachel wrote a book about her experiences before she died." "What kind of book?" Naduah's laugh was bitter, the kind white people wanted to read. Full of suffering and degradation and gratitude for rescue. Nothing about the complexity of living between worlds. Nothing about the possibility that captivity might become something else over time. She paused, pulling Prairie Flower closer as a night wind rustled through the camp. "I learned to read Comanche winter counts, pictographic records of tribal history. I discovered that the raid on Fort Parker was revenge for something white settlers had done first. Always revenge. Captain Mitchell. Always another cycle of violence. What do you mean? 6 months before Fort Parker, a group of white hunters killed a Comanche chief's son in a dispute over a buffalo carcass. The boy was only 14. The raid that took me was payback for that killing, and now my recovery will be used to justify new raids against Comanche camps. The cycle never ends. Mitchell felt the weight of her words settling over him like a funeral shroud. This was not the simple story of rescue and homecoming that everyone wanted it to be. This was something far more complex and morally ambiguous, a human tragedy caught in the machinery of cultural warfare. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Naduah looked at him with those startling blue eyes, and he saw in them a kind of desperate hope. "Because tomorrow we reach Austin, and after that, everything changes. Tonight may be the last time anyone asks me what I actually experienced, instead of what they want me to have experienced." In the distance, a coyote howled, wild and free and infinitely lonely. The sound seemed to carry all the sadness of a world where people were forced to choose between identities that should have been able to coexist. As they prepared to break camp the next morning for the final approach to Austin, Mitchell made a discovery that would change everything. While helping to pack Naduah's few belongings, he noticed something odd about the beadwork on her dress, a pattern that seemed to incorporate symbols he didn't recognize. "What do these mean?" he asked, pointing to the intricate designs. Naduah's face went very still. After a long moment, she began to speak in a voice barely above a whisper. "They are winter counts, personal history recorded in beadwork. This dress tells the story of my life among the Comanche." Mitchell studied the patterns more carefully, beginning to see how the geometric designs might represent events, people, significant moments. But there was something else, symbols that seemed out of place, too complex for traditional Comanche beadwork. "And this section?" he asked, pointing to a cluster of particularly intricate patterns near the dress's hem. Naduah hesitated for so long that Mitchell thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her words sent a chill down his spine. "Those symbols record something that happened 2 years ago. Something that will change how people think about the frontier wars, if they ever learn the truth." "What kind of something?" She looked around the camp, making sure they could not be overheard, then pulled Mitchell to the edge of the firelight where the shadows offered privacy. "A meeting," she said quietly, "between my husband Peter Nocona and Colonel Robert Lee of the United States Army. A secret negotiation that almost ended the fighting." Mitchell felt his world shift on its axis. Robert Lee was one of the most respected officers in the Army, a man being talked about for higher command. The idea that he would conduct secret negotiations with a Comanche war chief was almost unthinkable. What kind of negotiation? A peace treaty, not just a temporary truce, but a real agreement that would have ended the cycle of raids and revenge. Peter Nocona was ready to lead his people to a reservation if the government would guarantee their safety and hunting rights. What happened? Naduah's face hardened with remembered pain. Someone leaked word of the meeting to the newspapers. The political pressure was too great. Lee was ordered to abandon the negotiations. 3 weeks later, his replacement launched a major offensive against winter camps, killing women and children. The implications hit Mitchell like a physical blow. If Naduah's story was true, then her recovery was not just a personal tragedy. It was connected to larger failures of policy and leadership that had cost countless lives on both sides. "Do you have proof of this meeting?" Naduah touched the beadwork on her dress. "These symbols record everything. Names, dates, terms discussed. Was Peter Nocona's wife. I was present when the negotiations took place." Mitchell stared at the seemingly innocuous patterns, realizing he was looking at evidence that could topple careers and rewrite the history of the frontier wars. No wonder the military was so interested in debriefing Naduah. But did they know what she actually knew? Or were they fishing for general intelligence? "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because tomorrow we reach Austin, and powerful people are going to try to control my story. They'll want to use me as a symbol of successful rescue, or as a source of military intelligence, or as proof that the only good Indian is a dead Indian. But none of them will want to hear about secret peace negotiations that failed because of politics. She paused, looking out toward the horizon where the lights of Austin were beginning to twinkle in the distance. I want someone to know the truth, Captain Mitchell, even if the truth is too dangerous to tell. As dawn broke over their final camp before Austin, Mitchell found himself caught in an impossible situation. The woman they had rescued was not just a captive returning home. She was a walking repository of secrets that could destabilize the entire political structure of the frontier. Her knowledge of failed peace negotiations made her both incredibly valuable and incredibly dangerous to people in power. The morning brought new riders, advance scouts from Austin, carrying word that the city was in a state of near hysteria over Naduah's impending arrival. Hotels were booked solid with journalists from as far away as New York. The governor had scheduled a public ceremony. Isaac Parker had organized a parade. But most ominously, Colonel Sherman's superiors had sent word that Naduah's debriefing would be conducted by military intelligence officers from Washington, men who specialized in extracting information from people who didn't want to give it. They're going to tear her apart, Dr. Whitmore said quietly to Mitchell as they prepared to mount up for the final ride. And when they're done, there won't be enough left of her to matter. Mitchell looked at Naduah, sitting straight in her saddle with Prairie Flower secured in front of her, her blue eyes fixed on the horizon where her new captivity awaited. She had survived 24 years on one of the harshest frontiers in the world, adapted to a completely different culture, raised children in two worlds, and now she was about to face her greatest challenge yet, returning to a civilization that wanted to consume her story while destroying the person who had lived it. As they rode toward Austin, Mitchell began to understand that the real mystery was not what had happened to Sarah Catherine Mills during her captivity. The real mystery was what would happen to Naduah now that they had brought her home. Behind them, the vast emptiness of the Texas plains stretched to the horizon, carrying on the wind the faint sound of drums from camps that were already breaking apart, moving deeper into the wilderness, preparing for a war that peace negotiations might have prevented. Ahead lay Austin, with its crowds and ceremonies and men in expensive suits, who had never seen a Comanche winter camp, but were eager to profit from one woman's journey between worlds. And in between, caught like a bird in a storm she had not created and could not control, rode a woman whose greatest crime was surviving long enough to learn the truth about how the frontier wars really worked. The beadwork on her dress caught the morning light, each symbol a small piece of history that powerful people would kill to keep secret. As the spires of Austin rose before them, dark clouds gathered on the horizon, both literal storm clouds that promised rain and metaphorical ones that promised something far more dangerous. In the distance, Mitchell could see riders approaching fast from the city, their purpose unclear but their urgency unmistakable. Naduah felt the weight of the secrets she carried pressing down on her like a physical force. The failed peace negotiations, the political machinations that had cost so many lives, the truth about what really drove the frontier wars, all of it recorded in the beadwork of her dress, waiting for someone brave enough to read the symbols and wise enough to understand their implications. But as the riders drew closer, Mitchell began to suspect that some truths were too dangerous to survive the transition from the wilderness to civilization. And the woman who carried those truths was about to discover that sometimes the most perilous captivity is the one disguised as freedom. The riders approaching from Austin were not the welcoming committee Captain Mitchell had expected. As they drew closer through the morning haze, he could see the grim faces of men who bore news that would change everything. The lead rider was Major Thomas Carleton, a political operative who served as liaison between military intelligence and the territorial government, a man whose job was to make inconvenient truths disappear. "Captain Mitchell," Carleton called out as he reined in his horse, his breath forming crystals in the cold air. "We need to talk, privately." Mitchell glanced at Naduah, who sat motionless in her saddle, reading the tension in the men's faces with the skill of someone who had learned to survive by understanding unspoken dangers. Prairie Flower stirred restlessly in her mother's arms, as if sensing the shift in atmosphere. "What's this about, Major?" Mitchell asked, though something in his gut already knew the answer would not be welcome. Carleton's eyes flicked toward Naduah, then back to Mitchell. "There's been a development. We need the prisoner isolated until we can assess the security implications of her recovery." "Prisoner?" Dr. Whitmore spurred his horse forward, his voice sharp with indignation. "This woman is a rescued captive, not a criminal." "That," Carleton said coldly, "remains to be determined." The word hung in the air, like smoke from a funeral pyre. In the space of a single sentence, Naduah had been transformed from rescued victim to potential enemy of the state. Mitchell felt the careful structure of everything he thought he understood about this mission beginning to collapse. "On whose authority?" he demanded. Carleton pulled out a document bearing official seals, direct orders from Washington. "Sarah Catherine Mills is to be held for extensive debriefing regarding her knowledge of enemy operations. There are concerns about where her loyalties lie." Naduah listened to this exchange with the stillness of a deer sensing wolves. When she finally spoke, her voice carried 24 years of hard-won wisdom about the nature of power and the price of truth. "You are afraid of what I know," she said simply, "and you should be." Austin, December. The Austin that awaited them bore little resemblance to the frontier town Mitchell remembered from his last visit. Newspaper banners hung from every storefront, announcing the arrival of the famous Parker captive. Hotels had booked every room to capacity with journalists, curiosity seekers, and what one headline called Indian enthusiasts, wealthy Easterners who collected frontier stories like exotic trophies. But beneath the carnival atmosphere, Mitchell could sense something darker at work. Military wagons moved through the streets with suspicious frequency. Men in expensive suits gathered in small groups, their conversations dying when strangers approached. The telegraph office operated around the clock, sending messages to destinations that were carefully unrecorded in the public logs. Naduah was not taken to the governor's mansion or the hotel where her uncle Isaac waited with tears and newspaper reporters. Instead, their small convoy was directed to an unmarked building on the outskirts of town, a former warehouse that had been hastily converted into what could only be described as an interrogation facility. "This is wrong," Dr. Whitmore protested as they dismounted in the building's shadowy courtyard. "This woman needs medical care and time to adjust, not imprisonment." Major Carleton's smile was as cold as winter stone. "Dr. Whitmore, I'm afraid your services are no longer required. This matter has moved beyond civilian jurisdiction." The dismissal was final, and Mitchell watched with growing alarm as the one person who had shown genuine concern for Naduah's welfare was escorted away. Now she was truly alone, surrounded by men who saw her not as a human being, but as a repository of potentially valuable secrets. As they led her into the building, Naduah turned back once to look at Mitchell. In her blue eyes he saw not fear but a kind of sad resignation, the look of someone who had always known this moment would come, and had been preparing for it, far longer than her captors realized. The room where they brought Naduah was designed to intimidate: bare walls, a single table, 2 chairs, and no windows. The men who entered after her wore civilian clothes, but carried themselves with military bearing. Their leader introduced himself as Mr. Davidson, though Mitchell suspected that was not his real name. "Mrs. Mills," Davidson began, settling into the chair across from her with practiced ease. "We appreciate your cooperation in this matter. The information you provide could help prevent future attacks on American settlements." Naduah said nothing, but her eyes never left Davidson's face. She had learned long ago that silence was often the most powerful weapon available to those without conventional power. "Let's start with something simple," Davidson continued, pulling out a map of Texas and spreading it on the table. "Can you show us the locations of Comanche winter camps?" Still silence. "Mrs. Mills, I don't think you understand the gravity of your situation. You've spent 24 years with enemies of the United States. Some people might question whether you've been influenced by their propaganda. Now Naduah smiled, and there was something in that expression that made Davidson shift uncomfortably in his chair. "Mr. Davidson," she said, her English careful but precise, "I think you are the one who does not understand. I have survived 24 years on the frontier by learning when to speak and when to remain silent. And I have learned that men like you are always most dangerous when they pretend to be reasonable." Davidson's facade of politeness began to crack. "Mrs. Mills, your husband Peter Nokona is responsible for the deaths of dozens of American citizens. If you have information that could help us apprehend him, then what?" Naduah interrupted. "You will kill him. Take my son prisoner as you have taken me. Continue the cycle of violence that your people started." "We didn't start anything," Davidson snapped. "Your savage friends have been murdering innocent families, as your people murdered Comanche families," Naduah replied evenly. "Tell me, Mr. Davidson, do you know about the buffalo hunters who killed War Chief Little Hawk's son in 1835? The boy who was only 14 years old." Davidson's face went very still. "I don't know what you're talking about." "No," Naduah said sadly. "You would not, because that murder was never reported in your newspapers. But it was the reason for the raid on Fort Parker. Always revenge, Mr. Davidson. Always another turn of the wheel." The interrogation continued for hours, with Davidson and his associates trying various approaches: threats, promises, appeals to patriotism, even suggestions that her children's safety might depend on her cooperation. But Naduah had learned patience in a hard school, and she gave them nothing of value. It was only when they brought up the subject of Robert E. Lee that her composure finally cracked. "We know about the secret meeting," Davidson said casually, watching Naduah's face for any reaction. 2 years ago, your husband and Colonel Lee. Care to tell us what was discussed?" For the first time since the interrogation began, Naduah looked genuinely surprised. Then her expression hardened into something approaching hatred. "You knew," she whispered. "All along, you knew." Davidson leaned forward like a predator sensing weakness. "We know there was contact. What we need to understand is what your husband was planning. Was it a genuine peace overture, or was he gathering intelligence about our military capabilities?" Naduah stared at him for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of terrible understanding. "You are asking the wrong question, Mr. Davidson. The question you should be asking is why the peace negotiations failed when both sides wanted them to succeed." "What do you mean?" "I mean that there are people in your government who profit from the frontier wars. People who make money selling weapons and supplies to the army. People who gain political power by promising to solve the Indian problem with violence. Peace was never in their interest." Davidson's face had gone pale. "That's a serious accusation." "It is a true accusation. And you know it is true, because you work for those same people." The room fell silent except for the scratch of a stenographer's pen, recording every word. Davidson looked at his associates, and Mitchell could see the calculation in their eyes. This woman knew too much, understood too much about the machinery of power that drove the frontier wars. "Mrs. Mills," Davidson said finally, his voice carefully controlled, "I think you've been influenced by enemy propaganda. Perhaps we should continue this conversation after you've had time to remember your loyalties." But Naduah was not finished. She stood from her chair with fluid grace, her bearing carrying all the dignity of someone who had learned to command respect in a world that wanted to deny her humanity. "Mr. Davidson, would you like to know what Colonel Lee told my husband during their secret meeting?" The room went dead silent. "He said that peace was possible, but only if good men were willing to stand against those who profit from war. He said that the frontier would run red with blood until someone had the courage to break the cycle. And he said that he was prepared to recommend a treaty that would give the Comanche reserved lands in exchange for an end to raiding. And what happened to that recommendation? Davidson asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. It disappeared into the same political machinery that brought you here today. Colonel Lee was reassigned to the east. His replacement launched the winter campaign that killed 40 women and children at Painted Rock Creek. And now you want me to provide intelligence that will help you kill more. Naduah walked to the door, then turned back to face her interrogators. I have told you the truth, Mr. Davidson. The question is what you plan to do with it. That evening, as Naduah sat in the locked room that served as her cell, she received a visit from the man she had once known as Uncle Isaac. 24 years had changed Isaac Parker from the young father she dimly remembered into something harder and more calculating. A man who had built a career on the tragedy of Fort Parker and was not about to let inconvenient truths destroy what he had created. Sarah, he said, sitting across from her with the kind of forced smile politicians used when they needed something. My dear, dear niece, how I have prayed for this day. Naduah studied his face, searching for traces of the man who had carved wooden horses for a little girl who no longer existed. What she found instead was the practiced sincerity of someone who had learned to monetize grief. Uncle Isaac, she said quietly, you look well, prosperous. Isaac shifted uncomfortably under her direct gaze. I've done well enough. The lecture tours, the articles about frontier life. People are fascinated by our story, Sarah, by what happened to our family. Our story, she repeated. And what story is that, Uncle Isaac? Why? The story of how you survived 24 years of savage captivity and were miraculously rescued by brave Texas Rangers. It's a testament to the strength of Christian faith and American values. Naduah was quiet for a long moment, processing the gap between her lived experience and the narrative her uncle had constructed around it. And if the real story is different from the one you have been telling? Isaac's mask of avuncular concern slipped slightly. Sarah, you've been through terrible trauma. Sometimes our memories, well, sometimes we remember things in ways that make sense to us at the time, but may not reflect reality. The condescension in his voice sparked something dangerous in Naduah's eyes. You believe I have been driven mad by my experiences? Not mad, dear, but perhaps confused. Influenced by your captors. It's common in cases like yours. Dr. Whitmore mentioned that you seem to have developed sympathies for the people who held you prisoner. Now Naduah understood. Her uncle had not spent 24 years searching for her out of love or grief. He had spent 24 years building a mythology around Fort Parker, and her actual experiences threatened to destroy the careful narrative he had constructed. What do you want from me, Uncle Isaac? I want you to come home, Sarah, to your real family, to rejoin civilized society. There are people who want to hear your story. The real story of how you survived and maintained your faith, despite everything you endured. And if my story does not match the one you wish me to tell, Isaac's smile became strained. Then perhaps it would be better if you said nothing at all, at least until you've had time to recover your proper perspective. The threat was delicately delivered, but unmistakable. Naduah had become an inconvenience to the mythology her uncle had built around their family's tragedy. Her actual experiences, her complex feelings about her Comanche family, her knowledge of failed peace negotiations, all of it threatened the simple narrative of savage captivity and Christian redemption that had made Isaac Parker a minor celebrity. I see, Naduah said finally. So I have escaped one form of captivity only to discover another. Isaac stood to leave, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. Sarah, you need to understand something. This is bigger than just your personal feelings. There are important people involved now, people who have invested considerable resources in your recovery. It would be unfortunate if their efforts were wasted. After he left, Naduah sat alone in her cell, understanding finally that there would be no rescue from this rescue. The forces that had brought her back to white society had their own agenda, and her role in that agenda did not include telling the truth about anything she had experienced. Late that night, Naduah received an unexpected visitor. Theodore Hartwell, the journalist who had tracked them from the first day, appeared at her cell window, a second-story opening that should have been impossible to reach without assistance from someone inside the building. "Mrs. Mills," he whispered through the bars. "We need to talk." Naduah approached the window cautiously. "How did you—" "I have friends who believe this whole situation stinks like week-old fish," Hartwell replied. "Dr. Whitmore for one, Captain Mitchell for another. Even some people in the territorial government who think you're being railroaded. What do you want? The truth. The real story of what happened to you and what you know about the frontier wars. But more than that, I want to help you tell that story before someone silences you permanently." Naduah studied his face in the moonlight, filtering through the window. "Why would you help me?" "Because I'm a journalist, and this is the biggest story of my career. But also because I've spent 3 days watching them try to turn you into something you're not, and it's making me sick." He pulled out a small notebook and pencil. "I can get your story published in newspapers across the country before they can stop it. But I need you to tell me everything about the peace negotiations, about what really happened at Fort Parker, about what your life was actually like with the Comanche." For the first time since her capture, Naduah felt a flicker of hope. Here, finally, was someone offering her the chance to control her own narrative. "Mr. Hartwell, if I tell you this story, it will be dangerous for both of us. Lady, I've been in this business long enough to know that the most dangerous stories are usually the most important ones." And so, as Austin slept around them, Naduah began to tell the real story of her 24 years with the Comanche. Not the sanitized version her uncle wanted or the military intelligence her interrogators sought, but the complex, nuanced truth of a life lived between worlds. Dawn was breaking gray and cold over Austin. When Naduah finished her story, Hartwell had filled 3 notebooks with details about the failed peace negotiations, the cycle of violence that drove the frontier wars, and the political forces that profited from continued conflict. "This is dynamite," he said, closing the final notebook. "If I can get this published before they silence you—" "They will not silence me," Naduah interrupted, "because I am leaving." Hartwell stared at her through the window bars. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I have played their game long enough. Tonight, I return to my real family." "That's impossible. You're under military guard. And even if you could escape, where would you go? The whole frontier is crawling with soldiers looking for Comanche camps." Naduah smiled, and for the first time since her capture, it was a smile of genuine joy. "Mr. Hartwell, you have spent 3 days listening to my story, but you still do not understand what I learned during 24 years with the Comanche. I learned that there are always more choices than the ones powerful people want you to see." She moved away from the window, and Hartwell could hear her doing something in the cell, quiet sounds that suggested careful preparation. "What are you doing?" "I am reading my beadwork," she said. "The patterns on my dress contain more than just personal history. They contain a map." "A map of what?" "Safe places, hidden camps, routes through the wilderness that no white man has ever found. My husband gave me these patterns because he knew that someday I might need to find my way home." Hartwell felt his heart racing with understanding. "You're going back to them." "I was never gone, Mr. Hartwell. My body was captured, but my heart remained with my family. Now I am simply correcting the mistake." As the sun rose higher, Naduah made her final preparations. She had spent 3 days studying the building's layout, observing the guards' routines, identifying the weaknesses in their security. What they failed to understand was that they were trying to imprison someone who had learned survival skills in one of the harshest environments on Earth. "There's something else," she said to Hartwell as he prepared to leave. "In my dress, sewn into the lining, there are documents. Letters between Colonel Lee and government officials about the peace negotiations. If you want proof of what I've told you, cut open the seam near the right shoulder." Hartwell stared at her with growing amazement. "You've been carrying evidence this whole time?" "I told you, Mr. Hartwell. The Comanche taught me that survival depends on always having more choices than your enemies know about. By noon, Hartwell's story was on telegraph wires heading to newspapers across the country. The headline of his exclusive interview would read, "The Woman Between Worlds, the true story of Sarah Catherine Mills and the secret peace that could have ended the frontier wars." But more importantly, the documents Naduah had carried in her dress were being examined by newspaper editors, political reformers, and honest government officials who were beginning to understand the scope of the corruption that had prevented peace on the frontier. The letters revealed a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of territorial government, officials who had deliberately sabotaged peace negotiations because war was more profitable than peace. Arms manufacturers, land speculators, and political opportunists who had built careers on frontier violence were suddenly exposed to public scrutiny. Isaac Parker's carefully constructed mythology began to crumble as Naduah's real story spread across the nation. The simple narrative of savage captivity and Christian redemption was replaced by something far more complex. A story about the cost of survival, the nature of family, and the political machinery that perpetuated violence for profit. But by the time the first newspapers hit the streets, Naduah was already gone. The escape had been planned with the patience and precision of someone who had learned strategy from master tacticians. Naduah had observed that the guards changed shifts at dawn, creating a 15-minute window when the building was minimally staffed. She had noted that her cell window faced a drainage pipe that ran down the outside wall. Most importantly, she had realized that her captors' biggest weakness was their assumption that a woman who had been rescued would naturally want to remain rescued. Dr. Whitmore had helped, though he would never admit it. His final medical examination had included leaving certain useful items in her cell: a small knife, some rope, matches. Captain Mitchell had helped too, though his assistance took the form of strategic incompetence in posting guards. As the sun rose over Austin, Naduah made her way through the network of allies she had identified during her brief captivity. Dr. Whitmore's housekeeper provided civilian clothes. A sympathetic telegrapher gave her access to recent intelligence about military movements. A former captive who had successfully readjusted to white society, one of the few, provided money and a horse. But the most important assistance came from an unexpected source: Captain Mitchell himself. "I can't officially help you," he said, as he met her at the edge of town, speaking quickly in the pre-dawn darkness. "But I can tell you that there's a military patrol heading north toward the Red River tomorrow. If someone wanted to avoid them, they might consider traveling northwest instead." Naduah studied his face in the pale light. "Why are you helping me?" "Because 3 days ago, I thought I was rescuing someone. Now I understand that I was participating in a kidnapping." She mounted the horse Dr. Whitmore had provided, a sturdy mare that reminded her painfully of the ponies she had ridden during buffalo hunts with her Comanche family. "Captain Mitchell, what will happen when they discover I am gone?" "There will be hell to pay," he admitted. "But I've been thinking about what you said, about cycles of violence and the choice to break them. Maybe it's time someone chose differently." As Naduah rode away from Austin, carrying prairie flower in a cradleboard she had constructed from materials provided by her network of unlikely allies, she felt the weight of 24 years settling into proper perspective. She was not running from civilization, she was returning to it. Her own civilization, built on principles of adaptation, survival, and the understanding that family was something you chose rather than something that was chosen for you. The manhunt that followed was the largest in Texas history. Governor Houston personally authorized the deployment of 3 ranger companies and 2 army units to track down the escaped captive. Newspapers across the country followed the story with breathless excitement, turning Naduah's flight into a symbol of frontier independence that resonated far beyond the immediate circumstances. But those who knew the frontier understood that finding someone who didn't want to be found in the vastness of West Texas was like tracking smoke through a thunderstorm. Naduah had not just learned Comanche survival skills, she had learned Comanche territory, Comanche hiding places, and most importantly, the Comanche understanding that the landscape itself could be an ally to those who knew how to read its signs. Isaac Parker's public humiliation was complete. The documents Naduah had provided to Hartwell proved that he had known about the peace negotiations and had actively worked to sabotage them, fearing that successful peace would undermine the victim narrative that had made him famous. His lecture career ended overnight, and he would spend his remaining years as a minor figure whose credibility had been destroyed by the very tragedy he had tried to exploit. The political fallout was even more dramatic. Colonel Lee's suppressed peace proposal was published in full, revealing the specific terms that could have ended the frontier wars 2 years earlier. The men who had blocked those negotiations found themselves facing congressional investigations and public disgrace. But the most significant consequence was something that would not become apparent for months. Naduah's story had planted seeds of understanding about the complexity of frontier life that would eventually grow into a more nuanced national conversation about the cost of westward expansion. 6 months later, Theodore Hartwell received a letter postmarked from a trading post near the Canadian River. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message written in careful English. "Mr. Hartwell, I am well. My family is together. The peace negotiations have resumed, though in secret and with different players. Some truths take time to grow, but they are stronger for the waiting. The woman you knew as Sarah Catherine Mills died at Fort Parker 24 years ago. The woman who escaped from Austin lives on in the place where she belongs. Thank you for helping me tell the story that needed to be told. Naduah." Attached to the letter was a small piece of beadwork, a geometric pattern that Hartwell eventually learned was a Comanche symbol meaning the path between worlds. He kept that letter until his death 40 years later, by which time the frontier wars had ended and the issues that seemed so urgent in 1860 had faded into history. But he never forgot the lesson Naduah had taught him about the difference between the stories people wanted to hear and the truths they needed to understand. The historical record shows that Sarah Catherine Mills was recovered by Texas Rangers in December 1860, but escaped from custody before she could be reintegrated into white society. Official reports claimed she died of exposure during her flight, but no body was ever found. Comanche oral history tells a different story. They speak of a woman who returned to her people carrying knowledge that helped preserve the tribe during the difficult years that followed. They tell of secret negotiations that eventually led to peaceful resettlement rather than military defeat, and of a leader who understood both worlds well enough to build bridges between them. Modern historians debate which version is true, but perhaps the answer lies in understanding that truth itself is sometimes more complex than any single narrative can contain. Naduah's story became a symbol of the possibility that people could choose their own identity, their own family, their own definition of home. The beadwork patterns she developed, combining traditional Comanche designs with elements that recorded her experiences in both worlds, became a new art form that influenced Native American craftwork for generations. Museums now display these pieces as examples of cultural synthesis, though few visitors understand that they are looking at a form of historical documentation that preserved truths too dangerous to record in conventional ways. Captain Mitchell resigned from the Rangers 6 months after the events in Austin. He spent his remaining years as a small-town sheriff, quietly helping other escaped captives disappear into new lives where they could define themselves rather than be defined by others. Dr. Whitmore continued his medical practice, but became known for his advocacy on behalf of cultural minorities. His writings on the psychological impact of forced cultural conversion would eventually influence government policy toward Native American tribes. And somewhere in the vast spaces of the American frontier, a woman who had learned to survive by becoming something larger than the sum of her origins lived out her days as proof that the most powerful choice available to any human being is the choice of who to become. The mystery of Sarah Catherine Mills was never officially solved, but perhaps that was always the point. Some stories are too large to be contained by the simple categories of lost and found, captive and free, savage and civilized, some truths can only be preserved by those brave enough to live them, regardless of what the rest of the world chooses to believe. The wind still blows across the Texas plains, carrying with it the echoes of choices made by people who understood that survival sometimes requires becoming something your original self could never have imagined. And in that wind, if you know how to listen, you can still hear the sound of someone who refused to let others write the ending to her own story.